In this video, we'll talk about statistical samples. And we're kind of starting into a statistical unit here. And this is usually a good spot to start, is talking about where does data come from. And that is why we have samples. We're trying to collect data. So there'll be a lot of vocabulary in this lesson, not a whole lot of thinking. A lot of this stuff is fairly intuitive. It's something we've been exposed to constantly, as we're constantly exposed to data, and our first question here is to make sure that the data is good, and that's what this video will be all about. So some vocabulary words here. First off, let's talk about population. So in statistics, population would be the grand group you're trying to say something about with your sample. So, for example, if you're trying to talk about all Americans, you would want to sample Americans. You wouldn't want to sample Russians, for example. Or, say, let's make it a little smaller. Let's say you want to say something about all 7th grade students. Well, you wouldn't sample high schoolers. It just wouldn't make sense to talk about it in that regard. So you want to make sure that your sample, the group you're polling from, is part of that population. Now, if I sample the entire population, if I survey them or whatever, that's what we would call a census. And a census is very time-consuming, very difficult to do. So a way to get around that would be to do a sample. And that's where we talk about, okay, if I pick a sample, I'm not sampling everyone in the population. I'm only sampling a small part. It'll save me time, it'll save me resources so that I can say something if I want to answer a question. Would 7th grade students benefit from video math teaching lessons, for example? And then I have to go through and I think, okay, I don't want to sample nationwide all of the 7th grade students. I just want to sample a handful. So in order to make sure I have a good sample, because I want to make sure that when I do get my data, it's not going to point me the wrong way, there's a few terms here that are going to help us make a good sample. The first of which is to ensure that the sample is random. And random is fairly easy to grasp in that you're not choosing, basically. You're having a system, whether you have a random number generator or you're just pulling names out of a hat. You're trying to do your best to make sure that you're not picking selective subjects in this regard. You're not picking just the students that are involved in sports, just the students that are involved in other extracurriculars, just the students that get 4.0s, those kind of things. The idea is it's random. You want to have a good, across the board, get a few of each group kind of thing. Okay, a second thing we have to watch out for is bias. So bias can be linked with randomness in some regards. Bias would be, say you want to know if 7th graders prefer video lessons, and let's say that you like them, well then you would go talk to your friends, ask them if they like them. If they like them, then that's bias. You're not branching out from your little group. You're having one very isolated opinion that maybe you share, and maybe it is what the population wants, but you have to ensure that there's not another opinion out there. And the last thing we have to do for a sample is we have to try and ensure that it's representative. And what that would mean is that, say for example, we want to talk about all Americans, we want to ask something about all Americans, answer a question about all Americans, we wouldn't just sample Montanans. To be representative, we would probably want to branch out of one state. We would want to go out and sample some Californians. We'd want to sample some people from Florida. We'd want to sample some New Yorkers. We'd want to sample some people from Colorado, from the Midwest, from the Southeast. We'd want to break it up into regions at the very least and kind of make sure that we are hitting all the points. So when you are going through, a lot of what this lesson is about is making sure that your data is good. So the first question you want to ask yourself if someone's explaining a sampling thing is it random? Were these subjects picked at random in some way? Or did someone just say, I'm going to go pick these handful of people because they share my opinion? You want to make sure that it's random first. And then the next question is, could it be biased? And a lot of these things do kind of go hand in hand, but the idea is, okay, if I've made this sample and it's random, is there any chance that maybe I picked from the wrong group of people? Like for the example of, okay, if I want to answer something about all Americans and I just sample Montanans. Maybe I did randomly sample the Montanans, but it would be heavily biased towards what Montanans would think, as opposed to the whole nation. So bias would be, is it a whole picture, or am I just looking at a tiny piece? And then the last question, is it representative? And usually, if you deal with the first two questions and the answer is yes to being random and no to being biased, usually the representativeness will kind of handle itself. Now, the only difference would be, say I want to ask Americans how they will vote in the next presidential election. I sample 50 Montanans, 5 Californians, and 2 New Yorkers. Well, it is random. It's not very biased. However, it's not necessarily representative. If you think about Montana, it only gets 3 electoral college votes versus California, where it gets 55, I do believe, a much higher number. So it would make more sense for me to sample more Californians than it would Montanans if I'm going to try and make it representative. So just be cautious of those. A lot of these things do go hand in hand. And usually, if you can ensure it's random, these other two will follow in suit. However, sometimes you just have to be careful. So always be skeptical of where data is coming from. Always be asking yourself, does it make sense? Is there any flaw here that I could see?